The carriage door slammed shut before Eleanor Hartwell could say goodbye to the only home she had ever known. Through the small window, she watched the narrow street disappear, the bakery, the chapel, the crooked fence her father always meant to fix. None of it mattered now. She belonged to another man, in another house, and there was no road that led back. Her father had not even come to see her off. He had signed the papers the night before with a shaking hand, his eyes wet, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am sorry, Eleanor. I had no other way." She had wanted to scream at him, to ask how a father could trade his own daughter to erase a debt, but the words had caught in her throat. Anger would not save her now, only her wits would. The carriage rocked over uneven stone as it climbed higher into the hills, away from the town, away from everything familiar. The driver had not spoken a single word since they left, and the silence pressed against her like a hand over her mouth. She pulled her shawl tighter and stared out at the darkening sky, trying to steady the storm inside her chest. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the county had. Duke Gideon Ashworth, the man they called the Beast, locked away in his stone house on the hill, feared by servants and nobles alike. Some said he had killed a man with his bare hands. Others said a woman had broken his heart so completely that he swore never to feel anything again. Eleanor did not know which story was true, if any of them were. All she knew was that her father owed him a debt too large to pay, and that debt had become her. The carriage slowed as it passed through a stone gate taller than any building in her village. Ashworth Hall rose out of the mist like something carved from the mountain itself, dark windows staring down at her like 100 watching eyes. Eleanor's breath caught. She had imagined a grand house. She had not imagined a fortress. A woman waited on the front steps, her hands folded, her face unreadable. She was tall, dressed in gray, with silver threaded through dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her expression along with it. This was Margaret Pierce, the housekeeper, though Eleanor did not yet know her name. "You must be the Hartwell girl," the woman said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "Come. His Grace does not like to be kept waiting." Eleanor stepped down from the carriage, her legs unsteady after the long ride, and followed the woman through doors so heavy it took 2 footmen to open them. Inside, the hall stretched upward into shadow, candles flickering along walls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The air smelled of old wood and cold stone. Nothing about this place felt like it welcomed anyone. "They do not speak of him kindly in town," Eleanor said, unable to keep the words inside any longer. "Is it true what they say?" Margaret stopped walking. For a moment, something flickered across her face, something close to warning. "What they say and what is true are rarely the same thing, girl. You would do well to remember that here. Now come. He is waiting in the study, and he does not like waiting twice." They walked down a long corridor, past more portraits, past a window that looked out over gardens gone wild with neglect, roses climbing untamed over broken trellises. It struck Eleanor as strange, a house so grand and yet so clearly abandoned by anyone who might have loved it. At the end of the corridor stood a door of dark wood, closed, with a thin line of firelight glowing beneath it. Margaret knocked once, then opened it without waiting for an answer. "Your Grace," she said, "the Hartwell girl has arrived." The room beyond was dim, lit only by a fire burning low in a great stone hearth. A man stood near the window with his back to the door, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black that seemed to absorb what little light there was. He did not turn immediately. Eleanor stood frozen in the doorway, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it from across the room. "Leave us," he said. His voice was low, rough, like something scraped raw. Margaret hesitated only a moment before stepping back and closing the door, leaving Eleanor alone with the man the whole county feared. He turned then, and Eleanor forced herself not to flinch. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw, pale against skin weathered by sun and wind, and his eyes were the coldest she had ever seen, gray like winter sky, giving nothing away. He studied her the way a man might study a horse he was thinking of buying, assessing, measuring, already deciding whether she was worth the price paid. "So," he said finally, "you are the debt." The word struck her like a slap. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how deeply they had cut. "I have a name," she said. "It is Eleanor." Something shifted in his expression, so briefly she almost missed it. Surprise, perhaps, or something closer to interest. Few people spoke to him without fear, she would learn later, and fewer still spoke to him at all in that first meeting. "I did not ask your name," he said. "I asked if you understood your purpose here." "I understand that my father owed you money he could not pay," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I understand that you have taken me instead." What I do not understand is why a man with a house this large needs to buy a wife rather than find one who wants him. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour. She braced herself for anger, for the temper the whole county whispered about, the violence that made servants flee and neighbors cross the road rather than pass his gate. Instead, something almost like the ghost of a laugh moved through his chest, though his face remained hard as stone. "Careful, Eleanor Hartwell," he said. "Boldness is not always rewarded in this house." "Then I will have to hope I am the exception," she answered. He studied her a moment longer, and this time she did not look away, though every instinct told her to. There was something in his eyes beneath the coldness, something guarded and wounded, like a door bolted shut from the inside. She wondered, briefly, what kind of man built walls like these, and what it had cost him to build them so high. "You will be shown to your rooms," he said finally, turning back toward the window. "Margaret will explain the rules of this house. I suggest you learn them quickly. And if I do not wish to learn them," he did not turn around again, "then you will learn them the hard way, as everyone here eventually does. This is not your father's house, girl. There is no room here for softness." Eleanor left the study with her pulse still racing, her mind spinning with everything she had seen and heard. Margaret waited outside, her expression unreadable once more, and led her up a wide staircase to a chamber far grander than anything Eleanor had ever slept in. A fire had already been lit. A gown, dark green and finely made, hung waiting on the wardrobe door.
"This will be your room," Margaret said. "Supper is at 7. His Grace rarely joins the table, so do not expect his company most nights. Consider that a mercy."
"Why does everyone speak of him as though he is something to fear?" Eleanor asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed, the mattress softer than any she had known. Margaret's hand paused on the door. "Because fear keeps people safe," she said. "And in this house, safety matters more than comfort. Get some rest, Eleanor Hartwell. Tomorrow, this house will begin to show you exactly what it is." The door closed, and Eleanor was alone in a stranger's house, in a stranger's gown, promised to a man whose eyes held more sorrow than cruelty, though she could not yet say which one would win. Outside her window, the wild roses swayed in the wind, and somewhere below, she thought she heard the low, uneven sound of someone pacing, back and forth, as though even within his own walls, the Duke of Ashworth could find no peace. Before sleep finally took her, Eleanor rose and crossed to the window, drawn by the sound of pacing footsteps below. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and looked down at the courtyard, where a single lantern burned near the stable. A figure moved through the shadows there, restless, pausing now and then to look up at the house as though it were a cage rather than a home. She could not see his face clearly in the dark, but she knew, without needing to be told, that it was him. There was something almost pitiful in the sight, a powerful man reduced to wandering his own grounds in the middle of the night, unable to rest within walls he owned. Eleanor thought of the wild roses climbing over the broken trellis, untended and forgotten, and wondered if the man below had once cared for something the same way, before whatever had scarred him took that gentleness away. A soft knock came at her door before she could think further on it. She opened it to find a young maid standing there, a candle in one hand and a tray in the other, holding bread and a cup of warm milk. "Margaret thought you might be hungry," the maid said quietly. Her name, Eleanor would later learn, was Cora, and she was one of the few servants in the house who did not flinch at the mention of the Duke's name. "I am sorry the welcome was not warmer. This house does not often get visitors who stay." "What happened here?" Eleanor asked, before she could stop herself. "Why does everyone speak as though the walls themselves are dangerous?" Cora glanced down the corridor, as if the shadows themselves might be listening. "It is not my place to say, miss, but His Grace was not always like this. Something broke in him, a long time ago, and no one who serves this house has ever seen it mended." She hesitated at the door, then added, softer still, "Be careful who you trust here, and be careful what you believe. Not everything whispered about this family is a lie, but not everything is the truth either." Cora left the tray and slipped away before Eleanor could ask anything more, leaving her once again with only her own thoughts for company. She ate slowly, staring into the fire, turning over every strange thing she had witnessed since stepping through the gates of Ashworth Hall. A man who kept his household in fear, yet paced his own grounds like a prisoner. A house grand enough for a king, yet gardens left to rot. A housekeeper who spoke of danger with something close to sorrow in her voice. Eleanor did not know what waited for her in the days ahead, but she understood one thing clearly as she finally climbed into the unfamiliar bed and closed her eyes. Whatever secrets Ashworth Hall was hiding within its cold stone walls, she intended to uncover every single one of them, no matter what it cost her. She lay awake long into the night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, and made herself a quiet promise. Whatever this house wanted to break in her, she would not let it. She had been sold like property, traded to settle a debt she never owed, but she refused to become the frightened, silent thing everyone expected her to be. If the beast of Ashworth Hall wanted obedience, he would have to look for it somewhere else. Eleanor Hartwell had not come here to be controlled. She had come here to survive. And somewhere deep inside, a smaller, more dangerous thought began to form. Survival might not be the only thing this house had waiting for her. Morning came with a knock that sounded more like a warning than a greeting. Eleanor woke to find Margaret standing at the foot of her bed, arms crossed, a plain gray dress draped over one arm. "You slept late," Margaret said. "In this house, that is not a habit you can afford to keep." Eleanor sat up, blinking against the pale light spilling through the curtains. "What time is it?" "Past 7. Breakfast is finished. His Grace does not wait for anyone, and neither does this household. Dress quickly. There is much you need to learn today, and little patience for teaching it twice." Eleanor dressed in silence, pulling on the plain gray gown that felt like a costume for a role she had not agreed to play. As Margaret led her down the wide staircase, she noticed how the house looked different in daylight, less like a fortress and more like something abandoned mid-breath. Grand furniture draped in dust cloths, entire wings with their doors closed and locked. "Why are so many rooms shut?" Eleanor asked. Margaret's steps did not slow, because His Grace prefers it that way. Fewer rooms mean fewer memories waiting behind doors. You would do well not to ask too many questions, girl. Curiosity has a way of turning into trouble in this house. They passed through the kitchens, where a heavy-set cook named Agnes barked orders at two younger girls, and out into a walled garden that had once clearly been beautiful. Wild roses climbed everywhere now, untamed, thorns catching at Eleanor's skirt as Margaret led her along a narrow path. "This was Her Grace's garden once," Margaret said, and something in her voice softened for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. "His mother's. She died when he was young, and no one has touched this garden since. He will not allow it." Eleanor looked around at the tangled vines, the roses fighting through weeds for a bit of sunlight, and felt something twist in her chest, something close to understanding. A boy who lost his mother and locked her garden away rather than watch it fade further. It did not excuse the coldness she had seen in his eyes the night before, but it began, faintly, to explain it. "The rules of this house are simple," Margaret continued, leading her back inside. "You do not enter his study uninvited. You do not ask about his past, or his scar, or anything from before you arrived. You do not wander the East Wing after dark, and you never, under any circumstance, raise your voice to him, no matter what he says to provoke you. And if I do?" Margaret stopped at the base of the staircase and turned to face her directly. "Then you will learn exactly why the whole county calls him what they do. I have seen grown men reduced to silence by his temper, Eleanor. I would not wish that on you." Eleanor considered this warning carefully, but something stubborn in her refused to simply accept it. She had spent her whole life being told what to do, first by a father who traded her away without asking, and now by a housekeeper who spoke of the Duke as though he were a storm to be avoided rather than a man to be understood. She was tired of shrinking herself to fit other people's fear. In the afternoon, while Margaret was occupied with the household accounts, Eleanor wandered the corridors on her own. Drawn by curiosity she knew she should resist. She found herself near a small sitting room at the end of the East Wing, where a young woman sat curled in a window seat, a book open on her lap though her eyes were fixed on the garden outside rather than the page. The young woman looked up sharply at the sound of footsteps, startled, then softened when she saw Eleanor standing uncertainly in the doorway. "You must be her," the young woman said. "The one my brother married for the debt." Eleanor hesitated. "I am Eleanor," she said carefully. "I did not know His Grace had a sister." "Most people do not," the young woman replied, closing her book and rising to her feet. "I am Beatrice. I do not leave this wing often. My brother prefers it that way, though he would never say so plainly. He thinks the world is too dangerous for me, though I have told him 100 times that the world is far less dangerous than the silence he keeps me in." There was something guarded in the way Beatrice spoke, careful in the way of someone accustomed to watching every word before it left her mouth. Eleanor recognized the caution immediately, having worn it herself for most of her life under her father's roof. "Is he truly as fearsome as everyone says?" Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Beatrice's expression flickered, something between loyalty and sorrow crossing her face. "He was not always like this," she said quietly. "Before our mother died, before everything that happened after, he used to laugh. I barely remember it now, but I remember that he did. Something broke that laughter, and none of us have ever gotten it back. What happened to her? Eleanor asked gently. Your mother. Beatrice's gaze drifted back toward the window, toward the wild garden below. That is not my story to tell, she said. And even if it were, I do not think you are ready to hear it. Not yet. But I will say this. Whatever cruelty you have heard whispered about my brother, know that it comes from grief, not evil. There is a difference, even if this house has forgotten how to see it. Before Eleanor could ask anything further, footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, brisk and purposeful, and Beatrice's expression shifted instantly into practiced neutrality. That will be Margaret, looking for you, she said. Go, before she worries. And Eleanor, be gentle with him, if you can manage it. He has had precious little gentleness in his life, whatever the county says about the temper he shows the world. Eleanor left the sitting room with her mind spinning, turning over everything Beatrice had told her, however little it truly was. A mother who had died, a boy who once knew how to laugh, a sister kept hidden away out of some misguided attempt at protection. Piece by piece, the portrait of Gideon Ashworth was shifting in her mind, from monster to something far more complicated, a man shaped by loss rather than born to cruelty. That evening, against every piece of advice she had been given, Eleanor found herself standing outside the study door once more. Firelight glowed beneath it, just as it had the night before. She told herself she only meant to ask about her father, about whether any word had come regarding the debt, but some smaller, more honest part of her knew that was not the whole truth. She knocked before she could talk herself out of it. There was a long pause before his voice answered, low and edged with irritation. Enter. Gideon stood near the fireplace again, a glass of amber liquid in one hand, untouched. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite anger, but close enough to it that her pulse quickened. I did not summon you, he said. I did not wait to be summoned, Eleanor answered, stepping fully into the room despite every warning Margaret had given her. I wanted to know if there has been any word from my father. Something flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. There has been no word, he said, nor will there be. The debt is settled. You are here. That is the end of the matter as far as your father is concerned. Eleanor felt something hot rise in her chest, not quite anger, something closer to grief she had not allowed herself to feel yet. So that is all I am to you, the end of a matter, a line crossed off a ledger. What else would you have me call it, he said, his voice sharpening. You were sold, Eleanor Hartwell. I did not pretend otherwise on the night you arrived, and I will not pretend otherwise now. Sentiment will not change the nature of this arrangement. Then perhaps you should have chosen a wife who cared to be nothing more than an arrangement, she snapped back, surprising herself with the force of it. Because I am not built that way, Your Grace, whether you purchased me or not. For a moment, silence stretched so tight between them that Eleanor thought she had finally pushed too far, that Margaret's warnings would prove true, and she braced herself for the temper the whole county feared. Instead, Gideon set his glass down slowly, deliberately, and studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she refused to. You truly are not afraid of me, he said, almost to himself. Should I be? She asked. Everyone else is. I am not everyone else, she said, and you have not yet given me a reason to fear you. Only reasons to think you are lonelier than you would like anyone to know. The words landed harder than she intended, and she watched something shift behind his eyes, a flicker of something raw and unguarded, before the wall came slamming back into place. His jaw tightened. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but colder than before. You know nothing about me, he said. Do not mistake boldness for understanding. Now leave, before I decide your father's debt was not payment enough for the trouble you intend to cause in this house. Eleanor left the study with her hands trembling, though not entirely from fear. Something about the exchange had unsettled her in a way she did not fully understand, a strange mixture of anger and something dangerously close to sympathy. She thought of the wild roses in his mother's garden, of the pacing figure she had seen from her window the night before, and wondered how a man built such thick walls around himself and still managed to look, in unguarded moments, so completely alone. Margaret found her in the corridor moments later, her expression tight with worry. You went to him, she said. It was not a question. I did, Eleanor admitted. And what happened? Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise his hand. But there is something broken in him, Margaret, something deeper than temper or cruelty. I do not think this house fears him because he is a monster. I think this house fears him because it does not know how to help him, and it is easier to call something a beast than to admit you do not understand its pain. Margaret's expression flickered with something unreadable. Surprise, perhaps, or caution, or the faintest trace of hope she seemed unwilling to allow herself. "Be careful, Eleanor Hartwell," she said finally. "Understanding a wounded thing does not always make it safe to approach. Sometimes it only makes the wound easier to reopen. For both of you." Before returning to her room, Eleanor sought out Cora, finding her folding linens in a small chamber off the kitchen. The young maid looked up with a tired smile, setting aside her work when she saw Eleanor's troubled expression. "You met Lady Beatrice," Cora guessed, before Eleanor had said a word. "I did," Eleanor admitted, taking a seat across from her. She spoke of a laugh her brother used to have, before their mother died. "Do you know what happened, Cora? Truly?" Cora's hands stilled on the linen in her lap, and for a moment she seemed to weigh how much to say. "I was only a girl myself when it happened," she said finally. "But the servants who were here still speak of it sometimes, in whispers, when they think no one is listening. The late Duchess was a kind woman, gentle in a way this house has not seen since. There was an accident, though some say it was not entirely an accident. His Grace was the one who found her. He was barely a young man himself at the time." Eleanor felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the fire nearby. "That would explain the silence in this house," she said quietly. "The locked rooms, the garden left to ruin." "It would explain a great deal," Cora agreed. "But it is not my place to say more, miss, and I would ask that you not repeat what little I have shared. His Grace does not take kindly to his past being discussed in corners, even by those who mean him no harm." Eleanor promised her silence, though the information settled heavily in her chest as she made her way back to her room. She thought of the man she had argued with only hours earlier, his voice sharp with practiced coldness, and wondered how much of that sharpness was truly anger, and how much was simply a wall built by a boy who had found his mother, and never fully recovered from what he saw. It did not erase the sting of his words, nor excuse the way he spoke of her as though she were merely a settled debt, but it changed the shape of her anger into something softer, something closer to understanding than she was entirely comfortable admitting. That night, Eleanor lay awake again, listening for footsteps in the courtyard below, and when they came, slow and restless as before, she found herself rising to watch from the window once more, unable to look away from the shadow pacing beneath the stars. A man surrounded by walls of his own making, waiting, whether he knew it or not, for someone brave enough to finally knock them down. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the hills just after midnight and shaking the windows of Ashworth Hall like something trying to force its way inside. Eleanor woke to the sound of thunder cracking directly overhead, followed by shouting somewhere below, voices raised in a way she had not heard since arriving at the house. She rose quickly, pulling a robe over her nightgown, and stepped into the corridor just as Cora came rushing past with a lantern, her face pale in the flickering light. "What has happened?" Eleanor asked, catching her arm. "The old bridge over the ravine has given way," Cora said breathlessly. "Two of the stable hands were crossing it when the storm hit. One made it back, the other is trapped on the far side, and the water is rising fast." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Where is His Grace?" "Already out there," Cora said. "He went the moment word reached him. Margaret is trying to organize ropes and lanterns, but half the staff is too frightened of the storm to be of any real use." Without stopping to think it through fully, Eleanor followed Cora down the stairs and out into the storm, rain lashing against her almost instantly, cold enough to steal the breath from her lungs. Servants moved in chaotic clusters near the stables, shouting instructions that contradicted each other, lanterns swinging wildly in the wind. Near the edge of the property she could see torches moving toward the ravine, and among them, unmistakable even at a distance, the tall figure of Gideon Ashworth, already soaked through, already moving faster than anyone else toward the danger. Eleanor pushed through the confusion until she reached Margaret, who was struggling to coil a length of rope with hands numbed by the cold and the panic of the moment. "Tell me what to do," Eleanor said. Margaret looked at her with something between surprise and desperation. "This is not your concern, girl. Go back inside where it is safe." "I am not going back inside while a man's life hangs in the balance and half this household is too frightened to think clearly," Eleanor said, taking the rope from Margaret's shaking hands. "Tell me what needs to happen, and I will help you make it happen." Something shifted in Margaret's expression, gratitude breaking through the fear, and together they organized what remained of the calm servants, gathering rope, lanterns, and blankets, and moving as quickly as the storm would allow toward the ravine where Gideon and two other men had already reached the broken bridge. The scene that greeted them was worse than Eleanor had imagined. The old wooden bridge had collapsed entirely in the middle, leaving a young stable hand named Thomas Bell clinging to a splintered section on the far side, the water below churning brown and violent, rising with every passing minute. Gideon stood at the edge of the ravine, rain streaming down his face, shouting instructions across the gap that the wind tore away before they could fully reach the frightened boy. "We need a line across," he called back toward the gathered servants. "Now, before the water takes what remains of that ledge." Eleanor pressed the rope into the hands of the nearest footman and watched as Gideon caught the thrown end, testing its strength with a grip that betrayed no hesitation, despite the danger clearly written across every line of his face. He wrapped it once around a broken post, then, before anyone could stop him, began climbing down toward the water's edge himself, finding uncertain footing on rocks slick with rain.
"Your Grace!"
Margaret shouted, horror plain in her voice.
"It is too dangerous!"
He did not answer her. He continued down, inch by careful inch, until he reached a point close enough to throw the second length of rope across the gap toward the trembling boy. The first attempt fell short, swallowed by the rushing water below. The second attempt reached, but Thomas's frozen fingers fumbled the catch. And for one terrible moment, Eleanor thought she was about to witness a tragedy unfold in front of her. "Grab it," Gideon shouted, his voice cutting through the storm with a force that seemed to steady even the terrified boy across the ravine. "I did not come out in this storm to watch you fall, Thomas Bell. Grab the rope and trust me to pull you through." This time the boy caught it, wrapping it desperately around his arm, and Gideon began to pull, muscles straining visibly even from a distance, his boots slipping against wet stone as he fought both the weight of the boy and the force of the current threatening to drag them both under. Eleanor found herself moving forward before she had consciously decided to, adding her strength to the men holding the anchoring end of the rope, pulling with everything she had, ignoring Margaret's protests behind her. It felt like an eternity, though it could not have been more than a few minutes, before Thomas finally scrambled up onto solid ground, shaking and soaked but alive, immediately wrapped in blankets by the servants who rushed forward. Gideon climbed back up the ravine's edge more slowly, his own strength visibly spent, and it was Eleanor who reached down first, offering her hand without thinking twice about propriety or the rules Margaret had so carefully outlined days before. He looked at her offered hand for a moment, rain dripping from his hair, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Then he took it, and she pulled with everything she had left, helping him over the final steep section of rock until he stood beside her, breathing hard, both of them soaked completely through. "You should not have come out here," he said, though there was none of the coldness in his voice that she had grown used to, only exhaustion, and something else beneath it, something that sounded almost like gratitude he did not know how to express. "Neither should you," she answered, still holding tightly to his hand, though she was not entirely certain why she had not yet let go. "But I am glad you did." They walked back toward the house in silence, the storm beginning to ease around them, the household staff following behind with the rescued boy safely wrapped and supported between two others. Eleanor could feel Gideon's eyes on her more than once during that walk, studying her the way he had on the first night, though the coldness that had defined that first look was entirely absent now. Inside, the house buzzed with quiet relief as servants tended to Thomas and dried themselves by the kitchen fires. Margaret ordered warm drinks for everyone involved in the rescue, her earlier composure cracking just slightly as she embraced Eleanor briefly, before catching herself and stepping back with an embarrassed clearing of her throat. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Margaret said, though warmth had crept into her voice for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. "Perhaps both." "I have been told that before," Eleanor said, managing a tired smile. Later, once the household had finally settled and most had retired for what remained of the night, Eleanor found herself pausing outside the study once more, drawn by the same flickering firelight beneath the door as before. This time, she did not hesitate before knocking. "Enter," came the familiar low voice, though softer than she remembered it being on any previous night. Gideon sat near the fire, a dry shirt replacing the soaked one from earlier, a glass of untouched amber liquid on the table beside him as always. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time, she saw none of the guarded distance that usually shadowed his expression. "I wanted to see that you were well," Eleanor said, standing just inside the doorway. "I am," he said. "Thanks to you, and to Margaret, and to every servant brave enough to face that storm tonight. You went in after him yourself," she said, stepping closer despite every instinct telling her to remain cautious. "That was not the action of a man who does not care what happens to the people in his household, whatever reputation the county has given you." Something flickered across his face, old pain surfacing briefly before he pushed it back down. "I could not let another person drown in that ravine," he said quietly. "Not after everything that water has already taken from this family." Eleanor understood then, without needing him to say the words directly, that he was speaking of more than the storm, more than the boy they had just saved. She thought of Beatrice's careful silence, of Cora's whispered story about the late Duchess, and she felt something in her chest ache for the man standing before her, so far removed from the beast the county whispered about, so much closer to simply broken. "You do not have to carry it all alone," she said softly. "Whatever happened before I arrived here, whatever ghosts this house is keeping locked away with all these closed doors, you do not have to face them by yourself anymore." Gideon's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he would retreat behind the same cold walls he always did, would order her from the room the way he had the previous night. Instead, he crossed the distance between them slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face, the years of grief he had carried since he was barely more than a boy. "You are a strange woman, Eleanor Hartwell," he said quietly. "Sold to me as payment for a debt, and yet you run into storms to save strangers, and stand in my study offering comfort to a man the entire county believes incapable of feeling anything at all." "Perhaps the county is wrong about you," she said. "Perhaps," he agreed, though the word carried more weight than she expected, more uncertainty than the confident Duke she had first met would ever have allowed himself to show. He studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the firelight, before he finally stepped back, putting distance between them once more, though this time it felt less like rejection, and more like a man protecting himself from something he was not yet ready to face. "You should rest," he said. "It has been a long night for both of us." Eleanor nodded, though she found herself reluctant to leave, some new understanding settling between them that neither of them seemed prepared to name aloud. As she reached the door, his voice stopped her one final time. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the weight of formality attached to it. "Thank you. For tonight, and for not looking at me the way everyone else in this county does." She turned back to look at him, at the scarred, guarded, grieving man standing alone by his fire, and felt something shift inside her chest that she was not yet ready to name either. "You are welcome, Your Grace," she said softly, before finally slipping out into the corridor, leaving him alone with his fire, his ghosts, and the first genuine warmth that had touched his study in longer than either of them could say. Morning brought clear skies, the storm having passed entirely by the time Eleanor woke, though her body ached from the strain of the night before. She dressed slowly, replaying the conversation in the study over and over in her mind, uncertain what to make of the careful thanks he had offered, or the way his eyes had lingered on her longer than necessary before she left. She found Beatrice waiting near the breakfast room, an unusual occurrence given how rarely the young woman left her wing of the house. "Word travels fast, even behind closed doors," Beatrice said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. "They say you ran into a storm to help save Thomas Bell, and that you offered my brother comfort afterward that he did not immediately reject. That is more than most people manage in a year of trying." "I did what anyone would have done," Eleanor said, though warmth crept into her cheeks at the memory. Beatrice's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more serious. "Be careful," she said. "Not because I doubt your intentions, but because I know my brother. He has spent years building walls so thick that even I struggle to reach him some days. If you have found a way through, even briefly, he may frighten himself as much as he frightens everyone else. Grief makes people strange that way. Sometimes the closer someone gets to healing it, the harder a wounded man will push them away, simply because hope feels more dangerous than despair ever did." Eleanor considered this warning carefully, remembering the way Gideon had stepped back from her in the study, putting distance between them just as the moment had begun to feel like something real. "Do you think he is capable of it?" she asked quietly. "Of letting someone in, truly, after everything that happened to your mother?" Beatrice was quiet for a long moment, staring out toward the garden where the wild roses continued their slow, stubborn battle against the neglect that had been forced upon them. "I think," she said finally, "that my brother is exactly like that garden. Everyone assumes it is ruined beyond saving, choked by thorns and left to rot. But roses are stubborn things, Eleanor. Even buried under years of neglect, they do not stop trying to bloom. They simply need someone patient enough, and brave enough, to clear away what has grown wild around them." The words settled deeply in Eleanor's chest as she made her way through the rest of her day, helping Margaret oversee the household's recovery from the storm, checking on Thomas Bell as he rested in the servants' quarters, and finding herself, more than once, glancing toward the study door, wondering if Gideon would seek her out the way she had sought him out the night before. "He did not that day, nor the day after," Margaret explained, with a knowing look that suggested she understood more than she let on. that His Grace had ridden out early each morning to inspect the storm damage across the estate, returning late and retreating immediately to his study without summoning anyone. Eleanor recognized the pattern for what it was, a man retreating exactly as Beatrice had warned he might, frightened not by the storm outside his walls but by the one that had begun quietly building within them. On the third evening, unable to bear the distance any longer, Eleanor climbed the narrow stairs to the highest point of the house. A small tower room Cora had once mentioned offered the best view of the entire estate. She found the door unlocked, the room dusty from disuse, and stepped inside to watch the sun set behind the hills, painting the wild garden below in shades of gold and deep red. She did not hear him approach until his voice broke the silence behind her, quieter than she had ever heard it. "This was her favorite room," he said. "My mother's. She used to bring me here as a boy, to watch the sunset and tell me stories about the roses below, how each color meant something different, how she planted new ones every spring no matter how many winters tried to kill them." Eleanor turned to find him standing in the doorway, hesitant in a way that felt entirely unlike the commanding figure she had first met. "Why did you stop coming here?" she asked gently. "Because after she died, the sunset stopped feeling beautiful," he admitted. "It only reminded me of everything I lost the moment I could no longer share it with her. Easier to lock the door and pretend the room did not exist than to face what it meant every single evening." "And now?" Eleanor asked softly. "Why come now?" He stepped further into the room, closing the distance between them until he stood close enough that she could see the uncertainty written plainly across his face, an expression the county would never believe the Beast of Ashworth capable of wearing. "Because for the first time in a very long while," he said, "someone made the sunset feel worth watching again." The carriage arrived unannounced on a bright afternoon nearly 2 weeks after the storm, its polished wheels crunching over the gravel drive with a confidence that suggested its passenger was accustomed to arriving wherever he pleased without invitation. Eleanor watched from the upstairs window as a tall, elegantly dressed man stepped down, removing his hat with a flourish and glancing up at the house as though he already owned every stone of it. "Who is that?" Eleanor asked, finding Margaret nearby. Margaret's expression tightened the moment she looked out the window. "Lord Julian Fay," she said, her voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "A neighbor, of sorts, though his lands border ours in ways that have caused disputes for years. He and His Grace have never been friends, whatever pleasant face Lord Fay chooses to show at the front door. Why is he here now?" "That," Margaret said grimly, "I intend to find out before he charms his way any further into this house." By the time Eleanor made her way downstairs, Julian Fay had already settled himself comfortably in the drawing room, accepting tea from a flustered maid with an easy smile that seemed designed to put everyone around him at ease. He rose the moment Eleanor entered, bowing with a theatrical grace that felt entirely different from the guarded stillness she had grown used to in Gideon's presence. "You must be the new lady of the house," he said, his eyes assessing her with open admiration. "The stories reaching the county do not do you justice. I had heard the Beast of Ashworth had taken a wife, but no one mentioned she was quite this remarkable." Eleanor felt an immediate wariness beneath his charm, something calculated in the warmth of his smile that reminded her uncomfortably of merchants back home, who complimented loudest right before asking for the highest price. "I am Eleanor," she said carefully, taking a seat across from him rather than beside him, "and I did not realize His Grace was expecting visitors today." "He was not," Julian admitted with a conspiratorial grin. "I find unannounced visits reveal far more about a household than the carefully arranged kind. Though judging by the housekeeper's expression when she let me in, I suspect I am not entirely welcome here regardless of the hour." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened again, and Gideon entered, his expression immediately hardening at the sight of his guest. Whatever ease had begun to settle into his features over the past weeks vanished entirely, replaced by the same cold guardedness Eleanor had first encountered on her arrival. "Julian," he said, his voice flat, "I do not recall extending an invitation." "Gideon, always so precise about invitations," Julian replied, unbothered by the chill in the room. "I came to offer condolences, actually. I heard about the bridge collapsing during the storm. Terrible business. And to meet your lovely new Duchess, of course, since the whole county has been buzzing with curiosity about her ever since the wedding." "There is nothing here that concerns you," Gideon said. "I would ask you to state your true business and leave, before I lose what little patience I have for these visits." Julian's smile did not waver, though something sharper flickered briefly behind his eyes. "Straight to business, then, as always." "Very well. I came to discuss the northern boundary, the disputed section near the old mill. My surveyors believe the original markers were moved decades ago, likely by your father, and I intend to have the matter formally reviewed. I thought it only courteous to inform you directly before involving the courts." The tension in the room thickened instantly. Eleanor watched Gideon's jaw tighten, his hands curling slightly at his sides, though he held his composure with visible effort. "That land has belonged to Ashworth for 3 generations," he said. "You will find no court in this county willing to entertain such a claim." "Perhaps not," Julian said pleasantly, rising from his seat. "Or perhaps the courts will find the matter more interesting than you expect. Either way, I felt it was only right to give you fair warning, neighbor to neighbor." He turned toward Eleanor before leaving, offering another warm smile that felt entirely too practiced. "It was a genuine pleasure meeting you, Eleanor. I do hope we see more of each other. This county could use a bit more warmth, given how cold its master tends to be." After Julian's carriage disappeared down the drive, the house settled into an uneasy quiet. Eleanor found Gideon alone in the study that evening, staring into the fire with an intensity that suggested his thoughts were far from peaceful. "He wants the mill land," Gideon said without turning around, aware of her presence without needing to look. "It has nothing to do with old boundary markers. He wants leverage, and he will use whatever means necessary to get it, including, I suspect, getting closer to you." Eleanor felt a flicker of unease at the words. "What do you mean?" "Julian Fay does not do anything without purpose," Gideon said, finally turning to face her. "He is charming because charm serves him. If he believes befriending my wife might weaken my position, or extract information he can use against this estate, he will pursue that path without hesitation, however pleasant he makes it appear." "You do not trust me to see through him," Eleanor said, an edge creeping into her voice despite herself. "It is not you I do not trust," Gideon said. "It is him. I have watched him ruin better men than myself with nothing more than a smile and patient timing. I do not wish to see you caught in whatever game he intends to play. Then trust me to be careful, rather than trying to protect me from every shadow in the county," Eleanor said. "I have survived being sold to settle a debt, Gideon. I think I can manage one charming lord with wandering eyes and questionable intentions." Something in her tone seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders slightly, though worry still lingered behind his eyes. "Perhaps," he admitted. "But promise me you will tell me if he approaches you again. Whatever else stands between us, I would not have you caught in Julian Fay's schemes without warning." Eleanor agreed, though privately she wondered at the fierce protectiveness in his voice, so different from the cold indifference of their first meeting weeks earlier. It was, she realized, the voice of a man who had begun, however reluctantly, to care what happened to her. Julian Fay did not wait long to test that promise. Barely a week later, Eleanor encountered him again while riding along the eastern edge of the estate, his horse appearing almost too conveniently along the same path she had chosen for her morning ride. "What a pleasant surprise," he said, falling into step beside her despite her clear lack of invitation. "I did not expect to find you riding alone this far from the house." "I am hardly defenseless, Lord Fay," Eleanor said evenly, though she kept her guard raised. "Of course not," he agreed easily, "though I confess, I am curious. A woman as sharp as you clearly are, married to a man as guarded as Gideon Ashworth. It cannot be an easy life, married to someone who trusts no one, not even, I suspect, his own wife." "You know nothing about our marriage," Eleanor said sharply, though his words landed closer to old doubts than she wanted to admit. "Perhaps not," he said, his tone softening into something that sounded almost sympathetic, though Eleanor did not trust it for a moment. "But I know Gideon, better than most, and I know the kind of walls he builds around himself. I only offer this because I would hate to see someone as remarkable as you spend years waiting for a man who may never fully let you in. Should you ever tire of that wait, know that not every man in this county is quite so guarded." Eleanor turned her horse sharply, putting distance between them without dignifying his implication with a response. "Good day, Lord Fay," she called back over her shoulder, refusing to look back as she rode swiftly toward home, her mind churning with unease at how precisely his words had aimed for the very doubts she had been trying to bury since her conversation with Beatrice weeks before. She told Gideon everything that evening, exactly as she had promised, watching his expression darken with each detail of the encounter. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with a tension that reminded her of the first cold nights of her arrival. "He is testing the ground," Gideon said finally, "looking for cracks he can widen. I should have expected he would try this approach eventually. He is not wrong about one thing," Eleanor said carefully, watching for his reaction. "You do keep walls around yourself, Gideon. I have seen them come down, slowly, since the night of the storm, but I would be lying if I said I never wondered how much further you are willing to let them fall." Gideon met her eyes across the firelit room, something raw and unguarded passing briefly across his features before he answered. "Further than I have let anyone in a very long time," he said quietly. "Further than I intended to let anyone, if I am honest. Julian Fay does not know that, whatever he believes about the state of this marriage. But you do, Eleanor, even if I have been too much a coward to say it plainly until now." The admission hung between them in the firelight, fragile and unfamiliar, and for the first time since her arrival at Ashworth Hall, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that whatever this marriage had begun as, it was slowly becoming something neither of them had expected, something worth protecting from whatever schemes Julian Fay still had waiting in the shadows. Later that night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sought out Margaret in the small sitting room off the kitchen where the housekeeper often reviewed the household ledgers before bed. Margaret looked up from her columns of figures, surprised to see Eleanor still awake at such an hour. "You are troubled," Margaret observed, setting down her pen. "Lord Fay," Eleanor admitted, taking the seat across from her. "He speaks as though he knows Gideon better than anyone in this house. Is there history between them beyond a boundary dispute?" Margaret's expression grew guarded in the way it always did when old subjects surfaced. "There is history," she said carefully, "though whether it is my place to share it is another matter entirely. I will say only this. Julian Fay and his Grace grew up together, in a manner of speaking. Their fathers were rivals long before either son inherited the quarrel. But there was a time, before the late Duchess passed, when the two boys were closer than most brothers. Whatever soured between them happened slowly, over years, and I do not believe either of them fully understands how it happened, only that neither has found a way to mend it since." "That would explain the bitterness beneath his charm," Eleanor said thoughtfully. "He does not simply want the land. He wants something Gideon has that he does not." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something like approval flickering across her tired features. "You see more clearly than most who arrive in this house, Eleanor Hartwell," she said. "That instinct will serve you well, especially where Julian Fay is concerned. Men like him rarely announce their true intentions plainly. They circle, patient as vultures, waiting for weakness to show itself before they strike." Eleanor thanked her and returned to her room, though sleep remained elusive as she turned over everything she had learned. She thought of Beatrice's warning about wounded men pushing away the very people trying to heal them, and wondered whether Julian Fay's old friendship with Gideon had ended in exactly that fashion. Two boys who had once been close, driven apart by grief and pride until only rivalry remained where warmth used to live. The following days brought a fragile new rhythm to the household. Gideon began seeking her out more openly, no longer retreating to his study the moment supper ended, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to the quiet hours they spent together in the tower room, watching sunsets neither of them had expected to share with anyone again. Beatrice noticed the change immediately, remarking one afternoon that her brother had not looked so unguarded in years, though she cautioned Eleanor gently that old wounds rarely healed in a straight line, and that setbacks were likely to come before anything resembling peace could truly settle over the house. That warning proved prophetic sooner than Eleanor expected. Word arrived from town that Julian Fay had filed formal papers regarding the boundary dispute, setting a court date barely a month away, and with it came whispers that he had also begun quietly buying up smaller debts owed by Ashworth tenants, debts that, if called in all at once, could cripple the estate's finances at the worst possible moment. Gideon received the news with the same cold fury Eleanor had witnessed on her very first night in the house, and for a difficult evening, she watched the walls she had worked so hard to help him lower begin creeping back into place, fear and old habit warring visibly behind his eyes. "I will not lose this estate to him," Gideon said that night, pacing the study with restless energy. "Not the land my family has held for generations, and not the people who depend on it for their livelihoods. We will not lose it," Eleanor corrected firmly, stepping into his path until he was forced to stop and look at her directly. "Whatever Julian Fay intends, he does not know what he is truly facing, Gideon. He believes he is fighting a man alone in a cold house. He has no idea he is now fighting both of us together." The weeks leading up to the court date passed in a blur of urgent letters, visiting solicitors, and long nights spent poring over old estate documents by candlelight. Eleanor found herself drawn into the work almost immediately, her sharp mind proving useful in ways that surprised even Gideon, who had initially insisted she remain distant from the legal troubles threatening the estate. "You cannot shield me from this," Eleanor told him firmly, one evening as they sat together in the study surrounded by stacks of old ledgers and property deeds. "This house is as much mine now as yours, whatever the circumstances that brought me here. If Julian Fay intends to ruin it, then I intend to help stop him." Gideon studied her for a long moment before finally relenting, pushing a stack of old boundary surveys across the desk toward her. "Then help me find something in these records that proves the northern markers were never moved," he said. "My father was many things, but careless with property lines was not one of them. There must be proof somewhere in this house that Julian's claim is built on nothing but ambition." They worked late into the night, and over the following days, a strange partnership began to form between them, built not on the careful courtship Eleanor had once imagined for herself, but on shared purpose and mutual respect that felt, in its own way, far more solid than any romantic gesture could have provided. Margaret noticed the shift as well, remarking quietly to Cora one afternoon that the house had not felt this alive with purpose in years, whatever troubles had brought that life crashing back into it. It was during one of these late research sessions that Eleanor finally found something buried in an old ledger belonging to Gideon's grandfather, a detailed account of a survey conducted decades earlier that clearly marked the northern boundary exactly where it stood today, signed and witnessed by 3 separate parties, including, curiously, a Fey ancestor whose signature matched documents Julian had submitted to the court. "Gideon, look at this," Eleanor said, her voice rising with excitement as she pushed the ledger toward him. "This proves the boundary has stood unchanged for at least 3 generations. And this signature, it belongs to Julian's own great-grandfather. He witnessed the original survey himself." Gideon studied the document carefully, disbelief and relief warring across his features. "This is exactly what we need," he said. "If this is genuine, and I have no reason to doubt it given the age of the ink and the seal, Julian's entire claim collapses the moment this enters the court record." Their small victory was short-lived. 2 days later, Margaret arrived at breakfast with news that stole the color from Gideon's face entirely. A fire had broken out in the estate's records office in town overnight, destroying nearly a decade of archived property documents before it could be contained. The timing, everyone agreed silently, was far too convenient to be accidental. "He is more dangerous than we believed," Gideon said grimly, once Margaret had left them alone. "If he is willing to burn public records to strengthen his claim, there is no telling what else he might attempt before this matter reaches its conclusion." Eleanor felt a cold unease settle over her, though she refused to let it show plainly on her face. "We still have the ledger," she said. "It survived because it was here, in this house, rather than in town. Whatever else he destroys, that proof still exists." "Then we must ensure it remains protected," Gideon said. "And until this matter is settled, I do not want you traveling anywhere without Margaret or myself accompanying you. Julian Fay has shown he is capable of more than charm and legal maneuvering. I will not risk your safety on the assumption that he has limits." Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could look after herself as she always had, but something in the fear behind his eyes stopped her. This was not the cold, controlling demand of the man who had first called her a settled debt. This was genuine terror, thinly veiled beneath practical caution, and she recognized it for what it truly was, evidence of exactly how much he had come to care for her safety in the weeks since her arrival. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived sooner and more directly than either of them expected. Barely a week before the scheduled court date, a messenger arrived at Ashworth Hall, carrying a letter addressed personally to Eleanor, sealed with Julian Fay's own crest. She opened it in the privacy of her room, her hands growing cold as she read his elegant, careful handwriting. The letter offered her a private meeting, ostensibly to discuss what he called mutually beneficial information regarding her husband's financial position, but woven throughout the polite phrasing was an unmistakable threat, veiled references to secrets from Gideon's past that Julian claimed to possess, secrets he suggested might prove far more damaging than any boundary dispute if they reached the wrong ears in town. Eleanor brought the letter directly to Gideon rather than considering the meeting for even a moment, watching his expression darken with each line he read. "He is bluffing," Gideon said finally, though his voice lacked complete conviction. "There is nothing left to threaten me with that the county does not already whisper about." "Are you certain?" Eleanor asked gently. "Because this does not read like an empty threat, Gideon. This reads like a man who believes he holds something powerful enough to force my hand, and I would rather face whatever truth he intends to weaponize directly than let him control the narrative from the shadows." After a long, tense silence, Gideon finally spoke, his voice heavy with old grief he had clearly never shared with anyone in the house, not even Beatrice. "There is one thing," he admitted quietly. "The night my mother died, it was not the accident everyone believes it to have been, not entirely. She and my father argued violently that evening over debts he had hidden from her for years, debts that included money borrowed from Julian's own father. She left the house upset, rode out into weather far too dangerous for the hour, and never returned. I found her myself, at the bottom of the very ravine where we pulled Thomas Bell from the water months ago. I have spent every year since believing, in some private corner of my heart, that if I had stopped her from riding out that night, she might still be alive. Eleanor felt the weight of the confession settle heavily between them, understanding at last the true source of every locked door, every abandoned garden, every guarded wall she had spent months slowly helping him dismantle. "That is not something Julian Fay can threaten you with," she said firmly. "That is grief, Gideon, not a crime. A boy who could not stop a tragedy he never caused. If Julian intends to use your mother's death as a weapon, he reveals only his own cruelty, not any true wrongdoing on your part." "I know that, in my mind," Gideon said. "But grief does not always listen to reason, Eleanor, however much I wish it did." Together, they decided that Eleanor would attend the meeting Julian had requested, though not alone as he intended, and not without preparation. Margaret arranged for 2 trusted stable hands to remain nearby, out of sight but within reach, while Gideon insisted on waiting just beyond the garden wall where Julian had suggested they meet, close enough to intervene the moment danger presented itself. Julian arrived exactly on schedule, his charming smile firmly in place, though something colder flickered behind his eyes when he realized Eleanor had not come entirely alone in spirit, however isolated the garden might have appeared. "I am pleased you decided to hear me out," he said, settling onto a stone bench near the overgrown roses. "I trust you have considered what I mentioned in my letter." "I have considered it," Eleanor said evenly. "And I have decided that whatever secret you believe you hold over my husband, it changes nothing about my loyalty to him, or my resolve to see your claim against this estate fail entirely." Julian's smile faltered slightly, surprise flickering across his composed features. "You do not even know what I intend to reveal," he said. "I know enough," Eleanor replied. "I know his mother died the night she rode out during an argument over debts your own family was involved in. I know Gideon has carried guilt over that night for years, guilt that has nothing to do with wrongdoing, and everything to do with a boy who loved his mother and could not save her. If you intend to use his grief as a weapon, Lord Fay, you reveal only how little honor remains in your own family's name." For a long moment, Julian said nothing, something like genuine shame flickering briefly across his expression before his practiced composure reasserted itself. "You misunderstand my intentions," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "I did not come here to threaten Gideon out of cruelty. I came because I have carried my own guilt for years, Eleanor. Guilt over a friendship I let die out of pride rather than genuine grievance. My father's debts contributed to that night as much as his own did. I have spent years telling myself the boundary dispute was about land, when in truth, some small, bitter part of me simply wanted Gideon to hurt the way I have hurt, watching a friendship I valued crumble into silence and rivalry." Eleanor studied him carefully, uncertain whether to believe the sudden shift in his demeanor, though something in his voice carried a rawness that felt, for the first time since his arrival at Ashworth Hall, entirely genuine. "If that is true," she said carefully, "then perhaps it is not too late to end this feud honestly, rather than through courts and threats and burned records that help no one." Julian's expression flickered with something like relief, though old pride still lingered stubbornly beneath it. "Perhaps not," he admitted quietly, "though I suspect Gideon will need more convincing than a single conversation in an overgrown garden to believe my intentions have changed." "That," Eleanor said, rising from the bench, "is a conversation the 2 of you will need to have directly, without me standing between you as a shield or a weapon. But know this, Lord Fay. Whatever guilt you carry, whatever grief drove you to this feud, threatening me will not soften my resolve to protect this family. It will only ensure you find no ally in me, however this dispute ultimately ends." She left him alone in the garden among the wild roses, returning to find Gideon waiting anxiously just beyond the wall, relief flooding his features the moment he saw her unharmed. She told him everything Julian had confessed, watching surprise and cautious hope slowly replace the fear that had gripped him throughout the encounter. "Do you believe him?" Gideon asked quietly, once she had finished. "I believe grief makes people do strange, sometimes cruel things," Eleanor said. "I have watched it happen to you, Gideon, and I think, in his own bitter way, it has happened to him as well. Whether that is enough to end this feud honestly remains to be seen, but I do not think Julian Fay is quite the villain the county believes him to be, any more than you were ever truly the beast they whispered about." 3 days later, Julian requested a second meeting, this time with Gideon present directly. No gardens or hidden intermediaries, Only the two of them facing each other, across the same study where Eleanor had first argued her way past Gideon's coldness months before. She waited outside, uncertain whether the conversation would end in reconciliation or in the same bitter silence that had defined their rivalry for years, until finally the door opened and Gideon stepped out, his expression difficult to read. "He has withdrawn the court claim," Gideon said quietly, before she could ask, "and he has offered to return the tenant debts he purchased, at no interest, provided I agree to something he called long overdue honesty between us." Eleanor felt relief wash through her chest at the news. "What kind of honesty?" she asked. "The kind that admits our fathers ruined a friendship neither of us chose to end," Gideon said. He apologized, Eleanor. "Genuinely, I think, for the first time since we were boys. It will take longer than one conversation to trust him fully again, but it is a beginning neither of us expected." The relief was not to last uninterrupted. That same evening, as the household began settling into a rare, easy calm, a rider arrived from town bearing urgent news that stole whatever peace had briefly settled over Ashworth Hall. The magistrate investigating the records office fire had uncovered evidence implicating not Julian Fay, as everyone had assumed, but one of his own stewards, a man named Edmund Price, who had acted without his lord's knowledge in an attempt to curry favor by weakening Gideon's position before the court date. Worse still, the rider reported that Price had fled town upon learning the investigation was closing in, last seen riding hard toward the Ashworth estate itself, apparently intent on destroying the ledger that proved the boundary claim before it could be used against him, in whatever reckoning now awaited him. Gideon reacted immediately, calling for lanterns and gathering what men remained awake in the household, while Margaret rushed to secure the study where the precious ledger still sat locked in an iron chest. Eleanor insisted on joining the search of the grounds despite Gideon's immediate objection, reminding him sharply that she had proven herself capable during the storm months earlier, and she did not intend to hide indoors while a desperate man roamed the estate with nothing left to lose. They found Edmund Price near the stables shortly before midnight, attempting to force open a side door he mistakenly believed led toward the study, his face pale and desperate in the lantern light, a small blade clutched in one trembling hand, more out of fear than any real intention toward violence. Gideon stepped forward first, his voice carrying the same commanding steadiness Eleanor had witnessed during the rescue at the ravine. "It is over, Price," Gideon said firmly. "The magistrate already knows what you did. Running further, or threatening anyone in this house, will only make your situation immeasurably worse than it already stands." Price's resolve crumbled almost instantly, the blade falling from his shaking hand as exhaustion and fear finally overtook whatever desperate plan had driven him to the estate. He confessed everything on the spot, weeping with a mixture of shame and relief, explaining that he had acted alone, convinced that ruining Ashworth's claim would secure his position with Lord Fay regardless of the cost to anyone else involved. He was taken into custody by the estate's own men, to await the magistrate's arrival. The immediate danger finally, truly ended. Standing together afterward in the quiet stable yard, the lanterns casting long shadows across ground still damp from the earlier storm season, Eleanor felt the full weight of everything the past weeks had demanded finally begin to lift from her shoulders. Gideon turned to her, something fierce and unguarded burning behind his eyes as he studied her in the flickering light. "You could have stayed inside," he said, though there was no real reproach in his voice, only something closer to awe. "I told you once already," Eleanor said, managing a tired smile despite the exhaustion pulling at her limbs. "I am not built for standing safely aside while the people I care about face danger alone. You should know that about me by now, Gideon Ashworth." "I am beginning to learn a great many things about you," he said softly, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face with a gentleness that felt entirely unlike the cold, guarded man who had first called her nothing more than a settled debt. "And every single one of them makes me wonder how I ever believed I could survive in this house without you standing beside me." The magistrate's investigation concluded within the week, confirming everything Edmund Price had confessed that night in the stable yard, and with it came a quiet, official end to the boundary dispute that had threatened to tear apart both the estate and whatever fragile peace had begun forming between Ashworth Hall and its long-standing neighbor. Julian Fay sent a formal letter of apology, not just to Gideon but to Eleanor directly, acknowledging the danger his steward's desperate scheming had placed her in, and promising that whatever rivalry had once defined their families would remain firmly in the past from that day forward. With the immediate crisis resolved, a different kind of unease settled over Eleanor in the weeks that followed, quieter but no less persistent. She found herself watching Gideon closely during the rare moments he allowed himself stillness, noticing how old habits of guardedness still surfaced unexpectedly, a flinch when a door closed too loudly, a distance in his eyes when conversation turned toward his mother, even in passing. The danger from outside the house had passed, but Eleanor understood now, more clearly than ever, that the greater battle had always been the one waged quietly within Gideon himself. She raised the subject carefully one evening in the tower room, the sunset painting the wild garden below in familiar shades of gold. A place that had become, over the months, something like sacred ground between them. "You have not been back to your mother's actual grave since I arrived," Eleanor said gently, watching his expression carefully for any sign that she had overstepped. Beatrice mentioned it once, months ago, though she would not say more. Gideon's jaw tightened, old defenses rising instinctively before he forced himself, visibly, to let them fall again. "I have not been able to," he admitted quietly. "Every time I consider it, I hear my father's voice from that final argument, and I see her riding out into weather I should have stopped her from facing. It has felt easier to avoid the place entirely than to stand there and face what I could not change." "Grief does not heal by being avoided," Eleanor said softly, taking his hand in hers. "It only grows heavier, carried alone in silence. You do not have to carry it alone anymore, Gideon. Not this, and not anything else this house has locked away for years." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade behind the hills, before finally nodding, something resolved settling into his features that Eleanor had not seen since the night of the storm. "Will you come with me?" he asked. "Tomorrow, if the weather holds. I do not think I can face it entirely alone, not yet, perhaps not ever." "I would not let you try," she said simply. The following morning brought clear skies, and together they rode out to the small family plot at the edge of the estate, a quiet, overgrown corner shaded by old oak trees that had clearly gone untended for years, much like the garden beneath the tower room. Beatrice joined them as well, her presence a quiet, steady comfort as the three of them stood before a simple stone marker bearing the name of the woman whose loss had shaped every locked door and guarded silence within Ashworth Hall. Gideon knelt slowly before the grave, his composure finally breaking in a way Eleanor had never witnessed, years of carefully guarded grief spilling out in quiet, unguarded tears. Beatrice knelt beside him, her arm around his shoulders, and Eleanor stood close by, offering silent presence rather than words, understanding instinctively that some moments required nothing more than simply being there. "I am sorry," Gideon finally said, his voice breaking. "I am sorry I could not stop you from riding out that night. I am sorry I let your garden go to ruin because I could not bear to tend it without you. I am sorry it took me so many years, and a woman brave enough to walk into a stranger's cruel house, to finally find my way back here." "She would be proud of you," Beatrice said softly, wiping her own tears. "Not for staying strong all these years, Gideon, but for finally allowing yourself to be human enough to grieve properly. That takes more courage than any wall you ever built." They remained at the grave for a long while, the three of them, sharing memories Beatrice and Gideon had rarely spoken of in years, small fragments of laughter and warmth from before the tragedy that had reshaped their entire family. By the time they finally rode back toward the house, something had visibly lifted from Gideon's shoulders, a weight Eleanor suspected he had carried, since he was barely more than a boy standing at the edge of a flooded ravine, blaming himself for a storm he never could have controlled. A week after the visit to the grave, Julian Fay returned to Ashworth Hall once more, though this time his arrival carried none of the calculated charm or veiled threat of his earlier visits. He came instead with a small gift, a young rose cutting from his own family's gardens, a variety his mother had once traded with the late Duchess many years before their father's rivalry poisoned the friendship between the two houses. "I thought it fitting," Julian said, somewhat awkwardly, as he presented the cutting to Gideon in the newly restored garden. "My mother always said this variety was her favorite of all the ones she and your mother traded over the years. It seemed wrong that her garden should bloom again without at least one piece of that old friendship included in it." Gideon accepted the cutting with visible surprise, studying the young shoot for a long moment, before finally extending his hand toward Julian, an offering of peace neither of them had managed in years of quiet rivalry. "Thank you," he said simply, "for this, and for finally being honest with me, however long it took either of us to get there." "Perhaps we were both too proud for our own good," Julian admitted, shaking his hand firmly. "Our fathers built a wall between our families out of pride and debt, and we simply inherited it without ever questioning whether it was worth maintaining. I am glad, in the end, that it was your wife brave enough to ask the question neither of us dared to raise ourselves." Eleanor, watching from a short distance away, felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her at the sight. Two men who had spent years locked in bitter rivalry finally finding their way back toward something resembling the friendship they had lost as boys. Beatrice joined her a moment later, slipping an arm through hers with a small, knowing smile. "You have a talent for tearing down walls, Eleanor Hartwell," Beatrice said softly. "My brothers, Julie and Faze, even the ones this whole county built around our family's name after my mother died. I do not think any of us realized how badly this house needed someone willing to simply refuse to accept things as they were." "I only refuse to be quiet," Eleanor said, smiling as she watched Gideon and Julian continue talking, easier with each passing moment, old tension visibly dissolving between them. Sometimes that is all a wall truly needs, someone patient enough to keep knocking until it finally listens. That evening, the household gathered for a supper unlike any Eleanor had witnessed since her arrival. Julian himself invited to stay. Beatrice seated openly at the table, rather than confined to trays sent up to her wing. Margaret and even Cora permitted a rare moment of easy laughter, as old stories were shared and older grudges quietly set aside. It was not a grand celebration, nothing like the elaborate feasts Eleanor imagined such a house might once have hosted, but it carried a warmth that no amount of grandeur could have manufactured, the simple, hard-won warmth of a family slowly finding its way back to itself. In the weeks that followed, the transformation within Ashworth Hall became impossible to ignore. Gideon ordered the locked doors throughout the east wing reopened, sunlight flooding into rooms that had sat in darkness for years. He commissioned repairs to his mother's garden, working alongside the gardeners himself on quiet afternoons, clearing away years of wild neglect to reveal the careful paths and flower beds that had once made the space beautiful. Beatrice began venturing beyond her wing more freely, no longer confined by her brother's misguided attempts at protection, finding instead a genuine partnership in helping restore warmth to a house that had forgotten how to hold it. Margaret remarked one evening, watching Gideon laugh genuinely at something Beatrice had said over supper, a sound Eleanor realized she had never actually heard from him before that moment, that the house had not felt this alive since before the late Duchess passed. "I did not believe I would live to see this day," Margaret admitted quietly to Eleanor afterward. "Whatever cruel twist of fate first brought you through these gates as payment for a debt, Eleanor Hartwell, I believe now it was the finest debt this family ever collected." Eleanor herself felt the change as deeply as anyone in the household, watching the guarded stranger who had once called her nothing more than a settled transaction, slowly transform into a man capable of warmth, laughter, and a tenderness she had not imagined possible during that first cold meeting in his study. Yet even as the walls between them continued falling, one final conversation remained unspoken, a truth Eleanor had carried quietly since the earliest weeks of her arrival, uncertain how or when to finally voice it. She found her opportunity one evening in the restored garden, the wild roses now trimmed and flourishing under careful attention, filling the evening air with a fragrance that had been absent for years. Gideon found her there, watching the last light fade behind the newly cleared trellises, and settled beside her without needing to be invited, a habit that had grown naturally between them over the months. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said carefully, "about the night I arrived here. Do you remember what you called me, standing in that study, before you even knew my name?" Gideon winced slightly at the memory. "You are the debt," he said quietly. "I have regretted those words more times than I can count since then." "I was angry when you said it," Eleanor admitted. "Angrier than I let you see. I felt like nothing more than property being transferred from one owner to another, my whole life reduced to a line in your ledger. But I have realized something, watching you these past months, watching this house slowly come back to life around us both. I no longer feel like a debt that was paid, Gideon. I feel like something else entirely, something I do not think either of us expected when my father signed those papers." "And what is that?" he asked softly, though something in his eyes suggested he already knew the answer, hoped for it perhaps more than he had allowed himself to admit even to himself. "I feel like I finally found the one place, and the one person. I was never meant to simply survive," Eleanor said. "I came here believing I would have to fight every single day to protect whatever remained of myself from being controlled or broken by this house. By you. Instead, I found someone who let me remain exactly as stubborn and outspoken as I have always been, who never once tried to make me smaller to fit more comfortably into his world. You never controlled me, Gideon, not once, not even when the whole county expected you to. And somewhere between the storm and the garden and every quiet evening in that tower room, I stopped wanting to simply survive this marriage. I started wanting to build a life within it, with you, freely, not because a debt demanded it." Gideon reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that contrasted so completely with the cold, guarded man she had first encountered that Eleanor found herself struck once again by how far they had both traveled since that first frightening night. "I was sold nothing that evening my father died and left me this title," he said quietly. "Only grief, and walls, and a fear so deep I convinced myself love itself was a danger I could not survive facing twice. Then a stubborn, fearless woman walked into my study, refused every warning meant to keep her silent and small, and slowly, without either of us fully realizing it, taught me that some walls are worth tearing down, however much it terrifies the man who built them." He rose then, drawing her up gently beside him among the newly blooming roses, the evening light casting soft gold across features that had once seemed carved entirely from stone, now unmistakably, undeniably human, warm, and unguarded in a way the whole county would scarcely believe possible. "I do not offer you a debt any longer, Eleanor Hartwell," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability plain in every word. "I offer you a choice, freely given, exactly as it should have been offered from the very beginning. Stay with me, not because your father owed me a sum of money neither of us can any longer remember caring about, but because somewhere in this house of locked doors and wild roses, you found a way to make me believe I was still capable of being loved, and of loving someone else in return." Eleanor felt tears rise unexpectedly as she looked up at him, at the man the whole county still whispered about with fear, though she alone had come to understand the depth of gentleness hidden beneath that fearsome reputation. "I choose you, Gideon Ashworth," she said softly. "Not the debt, not the title, not the fear the county still carries about your name. I choose the man who pulled a frightened boy from a flooded ravine, who wept at his mother's grave after years of silence, who let a stubborn merchant's daughter walk straight through every wall he built and never once tried to push her back out. I choose you, freely, exactly as you have finally learned to choose yourself." They stood together in the restored garden as the last light faded fully behind the hills, the wild roses swaying gently around them, no longer neglected, no longer forgotten, blooming instead exactly as Gideon's mother had always intended them to, stubborn and beautiful despite every winter that had once tried to kill them. Whatever the county continued to whisper about the beast of Ashworth Hall, only Eleanor truly understood the man standing beside her now, transformed not by force or fear, but by patience, honesty, and a love neither of them had expected to find within walls once built entirely to keep the world, and every possibility of happiness, safely locked away. In the months that followed, word spread slowly through the county that the Duke of Ashworth had changed, that his hall now welcomed visitors with open gates rather than fearsome silence, that his garden bloomed more beautifully each season than anyone could remember. Few ever learned the full truth of how that transformation had begun, with a carriage arriving in the dark, a frightened but unbroken young woman, refusing to be controlled by walls built from grief and fear. But those closest to Ashworth Hall knew, watching Eleanor and Gideon walk together each evening through roses that had once been left entirely to ruin, that the county had gotten one thing entirely wrong about the man they called a beast. He had never truly been a monster at all, only a man waiting, patiently and without knowing it, for the one woman brave enough to prove that love, freely given, could never be bought, sold, or controlled, only earned, slowly and completely, exactly as theirs had been. 3 years passed, and the county that once whispered fearfully about the beast of Ashworth Hall now spoke of the estate with an entirely different kind of wonder, marveling at how thoroughly its master had transformed, and how completely the wild, neglected gardens had bloomed back into the beauty they had once been famous for generations earlier. Eleanor stood in that same garden on a warm spring morning, watching her young daughter chase a pair of butterflies between the rows of roses, her laughter carrying across the grounds in a way that would have seemed impossible to imagine during those first cold weeks of Eleanor's arrival. "Careful, little one," Eleanor called gently, though she could not fully suppress her own smile at the sight. "The thorns have not forgotten how to bite, even in a garden this well-loved." Their daughter, a bright, stubborn child named Alice who had inherited her father's steady gray eyes and her mother's fearless tongue in equal measure, laughed and continued her chase regardless, entirely unbothered by warnings that had never once slowed her mother down either. Gideon appeared a moment later, crossing the garden with the easy, unguarded stride of a man who had long ago stopped carrying the weight he once bore alone, scooping Alice into his arms as she shrieked with delighted laughter. "You spoil her terribly," Eleanor said, though there was no real complaint in her voice as she watched them together. "I learned from the finest example available," Gideon replied, settling beside her on the garden bench, Alice squirming happily between them, before wriggling free to resume her pursuit of the butterflies. You spoiled an entire county's expectations of me the moment you refused to be afraid on that very first night. I have simply been following your example ever since." Ashworth Hall itself bore little resemblance to the cold, shuttered fortress Eleanor had first entered all those years earlier. The east wing remained open now permanently, sunlight flooding rooms that had once sat locked and forgotten, and Beatrice, though married the previous autumn to a kind, quiet scholar from a neighboring county, still visited often, her own laughter filling the halls whenever she returned. Margaret had grown less guarded with each passing year, though she still ran the household with the same brisk efficiency that had greeted Eleanor on that very first frightening evening, and Cora, now overseeing a small staff of her own beneath her, often told newer servants stories of the young bride who had walked straight into a storm to save a stranger's life, and straight into a duke's guarded heart not long after. Julian Fay had become, against every early expectation, one of the family's closest friends, his lands now bordering Ashworth's not in bitter rivalry but in genuine partnership, their combined harvests and shared resources lifting both estates to a prosperity neither had managed fully alone during the years of feuding that preceded Eleanor's arrival. He visited often, teasing Gideon good-naturedly about the transformation from feared beast to doting father, though always with a warmth that made clear how deeply he valued the friendship finally restored between their families. Eleanor thought often, in quiet moments like this one, of the frightened young woman who had arrived at Ashworth Hall, believing she had been sold into nothing more than a transaction, a debt to be paid with the whole of her freedom. She thought of Margaret's early warnings, of the locked doors and abandoned garden, of the cold, guarded man who had called her nothing more than the settlement of an unpaid debt during their very first meeting. It seemed, from the distance of years and a daughter's laughter echoing through roses once left entirely to ruin, almost impossible to reconcile that memory with the man now sitting beside her, watching their child with an open, unguarded tenderness the county still occasionally marveled at. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Eleanor asked softly, watching Alice attempt, unsuccessfully, to catch a butterfly that seemed entirely uninterested in being caught. "Every day," Gideon admitted. "I think about how close I came to letting fear keep those walls standing forever, how easily I might have driven you away with my own coldness before either of us had the chance to discover what waited beneath it. I do not deserve the life I have found with you, Eleanor. I know that as surely as I know anything. You deserve exactly this," Eleanor said firmly, taking his hand in hers the way she had so many times over the years, in gardens and towers and quiet studies, through storms both literal and otherwise. Not because anyone bought or sold it for you, but because you chose, every single day since that first difficult conversation, to keep tearing down whatever walls tried to rebuild themselves. That is not undeserving, Gideon. That is the very definition of earning something precious. Alice returned to them a moment later, breathless and triumphant, clutching a single fallen rose petal she had somehow managed to catch instead of her intended butterfly, presenting it proudly to her father, as though it were the greatest treasure in the entire county. Gideon accepted it with the same solemn reverence he might have shown an official gift from a visiting dignitary, tucking it carefully into his coat pocket while Alice beamed with pride at her small accomplishment. "She has your instinct for finding beauty in unexpected places," Gideon said, watching their daughter dash off once more toward the rest of the garden, "and your absolute refusal to accept defeat gracefully. She has your patience for chasing something worth catching, even when the odds are not immediately in her favor," Eleanor replied, smiling as she watched Alice disappear briefly behind a trellis heavy with climbing blooms, only to emerge moments later with an entirely new object of fascination, already capturing her attention. As the afternoon light began to soften across the garden, painting the roses in warm shades of gold much like the sunsets Eleanor had once watched from the tower room during those early uncertain months of her marriage, she found herself struck by a quiet, profound gratitude for every difficult step that had led them to this moment. The frightened carriage ride through unfamiliar hills, the cold first meeting in a shadowed study, the storm, the ravine, the slow, patient work of clearing away years of neglect from both a garden and a guarded heart. None of it had been easy, and much of it had been genuinely frightening, but standing now in a garden filled with laughter rather than silence, with a daughter who would never know the cold, locked version of this house that had once greeted her mother, Eleanor understood completely that every difficult moment had been worth the life they had built together in its place. Later that evening, once Alice had finally been coaxed inside for supper and settled drowsily into bed after a day spent thoroughly exhausting herself among the roses, Eleanor found herself once more in the small tower room that had meant so much to both of them since those early, uncertain months. Gideon joined her there, as he often did on quiet evenings, and together they watched the last colors fade from the sky, above the hills that had once seemed so unfamiliar and frightening to a young woman arriving in a stranger's carriage. "I received a letter from your father last week," Gideon said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. He asked, again, if he might visit before the summer ends. Eleanor considered this for a long moment. Her relationship with her father had remained complicated in the years since her marriage. A careful, slowly rebuilt trust that neither of them fully understood how to navigate, given how their story together had begun. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him he would be welcome," Gideon said. "Whatever happened between you and him, Eleanor, whatever debt first brought you to my door, I do not believe he acted entirely out of cruelty. I have learned enough about desperation and grief these past years to recognize when a man is drowning in circumstances beyond his control, even when his choices cause genuine harm to those he loves. You have grown remarkably generous in your old age, Gideon Ashworth," Eleanor said, a teasing warmth in her voice that would have seemed entirely impossible during their first guarded weeks together. "I had a very persistent teacher," he replied, smiling in the way that still, after all these years, made something warm settle in her chest. Her father had written several times over the years, tentative letters filled with an apology he seemed unable to fully voice even on paper, and Eleanor had responded slowly, cautiously, allowing the relationship to rebuild itself at whatever pace felt honest, rather than forcing forgiveness before she was truly ready to offer it. Gideon had never once pressured her toward reconciliation, understanding perhaps better than anyone the particular weight of grief and guilt that lingered long after circumstances themselves had changed for the better. "Perhaps it is time," Eleanor said finally, watching the first stars begin appearing above the darkening hills. "Alice should know her grandfather, whatever complicated history exists between us. I would rather she learn forgiveness by watching me practice it imperfectly than never see it practiced at all." "Whatever you decide," Gideon said, taking her hand once more, "I will stand beside you through it, exactly as you stood beside me through every locked door and buried grief this house once tried to hide from the world." They remained in the tower room long after the stars had fully emerged, speaking quietly of small, ordinary things. The harvest expected that autumn, Beatrice's recent letters from her new home, plans for expanding the garden further along the eastern wall, where wildflowers had begun creeping in alongside the roses. It was, Eleanor reflected, exactly the kind of quiet, contented evening she could never have imagined possible during those first frightening days, when every conversation felt like a battle, and every silence felt like a wall she would never manage to breach. Yet here they were, years later, two people who had begun as nothing more than a debt and its unwilling payment, now bound together by choices freely made, grief honestly shared, and a love that had grown slowly, stubbornly, exactly like the roses climbing once more across trellises that had sat broken and forgotten for far too long. The county would continue telling its old stories for years to come, embellishing the tale of the fearsome duke and the merchant's daughter who tamed him, though Eleanor knew the truth was both simpler and far more remarkable than any story whispered in town. No one had tamed anyone. Two wounded, guarded people had simply found in each other a reason to finally stop hiding, and had chosen, day after ordinary day, to keep choosing each other freely. Exactly as love was always meant to work, given rather than bought, earned rather than controlled, and cherished all the more deeply for every difficult step it had taken to finally arrive there together.